In a glass-walled boardroom above the Montana foothills, CEO Vivian Blackthorne looked down at a scarred, misshapen drone and called it useless, a toy that wasted people's time while they waited to be rescued. 3 days later, her helicopter vanished into a sudden mountain storm over the Bitterroot Range, where radar went blind, radios went silent, and the company's own rescue teams turned back. Only Owen Calder, the quiet single father she had just fired, understood that the ridiculed machine sitting in his workshop had been built for exactly this kind of night. But to save the woman who had ended his career, he would first have to break every rule grounding him and find the person sabotaging the search before the last window of daylight closed forever. If you believe an invention dismissed as worthless can still be the thing that saves a life, tap subscribe now and stay with Owen as he races against the mountain, the storm, and the truth. Owen Calder had spent nearly 2 decades working in aviation before he ever set foot in a Blackthorne boardroom, first as a mechanic keeping rescue helicopters airborne through brutal winters, later as a systems engineer who understood, better than most pilots, exactly where a machine tended to fail when the temperature dropped and the wind turned violent. He had watched good crews lose precious hours searching blind canyons because no aircraft could safely descend low enough to see through the trees, and that frustration had followed him home night after night until it eventually became the seed of an idea he could not set aside. Owen Calder stood at the front of the Blackthorne Aerial Systems boardroom, holding the culmination of 4 years of work, a rescue drone he had named Rook 7, built from spare aviation parts, patched wiring, and lessons learned during his years maintaining mountain rescue helicopters. The machine was not beautiful. Its shell bore scratches from a dozen field tests. Its frame had been welded and re-welded, and nothing about it resembled the sleek products lining Blackthorne's marketing brochures. And Owen knew that before he even opened his mouth to speak, the executives around the table were already measuring it against their own expectations. Beside him, Gideon Wexler had arranged a glossy commercial drone from an outside partner, its casing polished under the overhead lights, positioned deliberately to draw every eye in the room before Owen said a single word. Owen explained that Rook 7 was never meant to film advertisements or deliver packages to front porches. It was built to fly into places where rescue helicopters could not follow, through narrow canyons, beneath low cloud ceilings, into zones where satellite positioning failed completely. He walked the board through a series of field recordings, showing the machine locating a training dummy buried beneath simulated avalanche debris, threading through dense timber that would have grounded any full-sized aircraft, and relaying its position home using nothing but inertial sensors when its satellite link was deliberately cut. Several of the younger board members leaned forward with visible interest, asking pointed questions about battery life and operating range. And for a brief moment, Owen allowed himself to believe the presentation might actually succeed on its own merits. Vivian Blackthorne, arms folded, asked for a live demonstration, and when Owen activated the drone, it rose smoothly for a moment, before its signal cut out entirely, sending it crashing onto the padded test mat at the center of the room. Owen felt his stomach drop, because the unit had passed a full diagnostic cycle that same morning, and there was no mechanical reason for the failure, yet the room had already reached its verdict before he could explain. Wexler moved quickly, telling the board that the drone's instability made it a liability to the company's reputation, and Vivian stared at the tangled machine lying sideways on the floor before delivering the line that would follow Owen for the rest of that winter, telling him plainly that his invention saved no one, that it only gave people something to stare at while they waited for real help to arrive. Vivian Blackthorne had inherited the company from her father and grandfather before her, and she had spent her entire career proving to a boardroom full of older men that she belonged at its head, a habit that left her guarded, exacting and deeply unwilling to gamble the company's reputation on anything that looked unfinished or unpolished. She judged people the same way she judged aircraft, by performance under pressure, and by the confidence of their presentation, and she rarely paused to ask whether a rough exterior might be hiding something the polished version of the same idea could never achieve. The project was canceled within the hour. Owen's contract terminated before he had even finished packing away the broken unit, and as he gathered the pieces from the floor, his fingers brushed against something that did not belong there, a small signal module wedged deep inside the drone's housing that he had never installed himself. Owen carried Rook 7 back to the small workshop behind his rented house on the edge of town, laying its components across his workbench under a single hanging light, and began tracing the mysterious module he had pulled from its frame. The device had been designed to interrupt the stabilizer at a precise moment, a deliberate act rather than a manufacturing flaw, and the encrypted signature buried in its firmware traced back to an internal Blackthorn network address, though Owen could not yet say whose hands had planted it. His phone buzzed with a call from his daughter Tessa, away at college, and eager to hear how the presentation had gone, and Owen kept his voice steady, telling her only that the board had decided against moving forward, unwilling to admit that he had also lost his job, unwilling to let her carry the weight of a decision that had already drained most of what remained of their savings. He considered sending the evidence directly to Vivian, but discovered his company email had already been disabled, and an hour later, a message arrived from Wexler's office demanding he sign away all rights to the data and designs he had developed during his employment, a document clearly drafted to bury Rook 7 for good. Owen sat alone at his kitchen table that night, with a stack of old bank statements spread out in front of him, tracing the years of overtime shifts, skipped vacations, and quietly deferred repairs on his truck that had gone into funding Rook 7 instead. He had never regretted a single dollar of it, not when he thought about the families who might one day get their loved ones back because of a machine that could go where nothing else could, but sitting there now with the project canceled and his job gone, the weight of those sacrifices pressed down on him harder than it ever had before. He thought of the years after his wife's death, raising Tessa largely alone, teaching her to check oil levels and read wind patterns before she was old enough to drive, passing along the same quiet stubbornness that had carried him through every setback since. She had grown into someone steady and capable, someone he was fiercely proud of, and he refused to let her see him break under the weight of a single bad afternoon in a boardroom, even if that afternoon had cost him almost everything he had built. Meanwhile, Vivian prepared to fly into the mountains for a meeting she considered far more important than any failed drone demonstration, a multi-hundred-million-dollar acquisition of Northstar Dynamics, a sensor manufacturer whose technology would let Blackthorn dominate the private rescue aviation market for a decade. Wexler assured her the weather posed no serious risk, insisting the helicopter's emergency locator system had been fully certified, and urged her to fly out ahead of the incoming front rather than delay the signing by even a single day. Owen, still awake at his workbench, pulled up the latest storm tracking data out of old habit and noticed the front was moving nearly 3 hours faster than the official forecast being used by Blackthorn's flight planning team. He looked at the small blinking icon marking the helicopter's flight path on his screen, then glanced at the disassembled pieces of Rook 7 scattered across his table, and felt an uneasy pull he could not yet explain. The helicopter carrying Vivian, her legal advisor Camille Rhodes, and pilot Dean Holloway pushed into the mountains as the cloud ceiling dropped without warning, turning the familiar canyon walls into gray, featureless shapes. Dean noticed the temperature falling fast, ice already forming along the leading edge of the rotor, and banked away from their planned route. but the terrain warning system began feeding him readings that contradicted each other, flashing conflicting altitudes as though it no longer trusted its own sensors. A close strike of lightning knocked out the primary communications array, and when Dean triggered the emergency locator beacon, its confirmation light flickered for only a few seconds before going dark, leaving them with no way to signal their position to anyone below. Forced to choose between fighting a rapidly icing rotor and finding solid ground, Dean brought the aircraft down hard onto a narrow rock ledge, the impact crushing the landing gear, snapping the tail antenna, and shearing part of the rotor assembly, though remarkably no one aboard was killed. Camille's leg was injured badly enough that she could not walk unassisted, and Dean's shoulder had taken a violent hit against the cabin frame, leaving him working through sharp pain as he checked the wreckage for fuel leaks and structural damage. Inside the ruined cabin, the wind screamed through the cracked window frame, and Camille pressed her injured leg against a folded seat cushion while Dean worked methodically through a mental checklist of every system that might still be salvageable, a habit built from years of training that kept his hands steady even as pain radiated through his shoulder. Vivian found herself doing something she rarely allowed herself to do in front of employees, admitting out loud that she did not know what came next, and the admission tasted strange in her mouth, unfamiliar after years of always having the next directive ready before anyone else in the room. Vivian reached for her satellite phone only to find no signal reaching through the storm, and for the first time in years she understood, with total clarity, that a machine worth millions of dollars had become nothing more than a cold metal shell buried somewhere in the white silence of the mountains. Back at Blackthorn's operations center, the helicopter's icon blinked once on the tracking display and disappeared, and because the emergency beacon had failed to transmit, no one could narrow down a search radius beyond the general region where contact was lost. Lena Hartwell, commander of the Regional Mountain Rescue Unit, mobilized 2 ground teams immediately, but deep snow, unstable slopes threatening avalanche, and visibility reduced to almost nothing, forced her to pull both teams back within the hour, an outcome that left the command tent thick with frustration and fear. Within minutes, news outlets picked up the story of the missing Blackthorn executive, and by the time Owen saw the headline flash across his laptop, he immediately recognized the coordinates of the search zone as the exact terrain where he had once tested Rook 7's low-altitude navigation system. Owen loaded the reassembled drone into the back of his truck and drove straight to the temporary rescue staging area set up near the base of the mountain, but a Blackthorn security guard stopped him at the perimeter, informing him flatly that he was no longer an employee and had no authorization to enter. Lena intercepted the exchange and pulled him aside, explaining that every civilian aircraft, including small unmanned units, had been grounded across the rescue zone because the wind gusts were unpredictable, and a rogue drone could easily collide with an incoming rescue helicopter. Owen did not claim his machine could outfly the storm. Instead, he laid out exactly what it could do, explaining that it could hug the valley floor, use the canyon walls as a windbreak, and operate only during the brief lulls between violent gusts, lasting no more than a few minutes at a time. He then pointed out something that had been troubling him for hours, that if the helicopter's emergency beacon had been functioning correctly, the search teams should have received at least one faint signal burst, and its complete silence suggested either a pre-existing fault or a defective component installed before the flight. Gideon Wexler arrived at the command post soon after, reminding everyone within earshot that this same drone had collapsed during its own demonstration only days earlier, and demanding that Lena bar Owen from any involvement in the operation. Quietly, he also instructed a member of Blackthorn's private security detail to confiscate the drone, framing it as a matter of protecting proprietary company technology rather than obstructing a search. Lena had spent 15 years commanding search operations across these mountains, and in that time she had learned to distrust confident promises from anyone who had never actually stood on a ledge at midnight, searching for a heartbeat under the snow. She had turned away plenty of hopeful inventors before, each one certain their gadget would change everything, and she carried the scars of watching a few of those gadgets fail at the worst possible moment, costing her team time they could never get back. Lena remained unconvinced of Owen's abilities, but was equally unwilling to dismiss a working theory when the official search had already stalled, and she granted him 10 unsupervised minutes outside the restricted zone to prove what his machine could do. Rook 7 located a buried two-way radio within that narrow window, tracking its faint signal through nearly a foot of fresh snow, then returned home successfully using its offline navigation mode without a single satellite connection, and Lena, watching the readout with growing interest, authorized one limited test flight into the search area itself. As Owen powered up the system for that flight, a hidden remote lockout command surfaced in the company software, waiting silently for the right moment to trigger and shut the drone down completely. Owen disconnected Rook 7 from Blackthorn's central servers entirely, switching it into a fully offline control mode, a decision that cost him access to the company's detailed commercial maps, but also stripped Wexler of any remote ability to disable the unit mid-flight. The first real flight launched from an old logging road at the base of the search zone, with the drone skimming just above the snowpack, weaving beneath low-hanging branches, and releasing its first signal relay node into the storm behind it. Owen ignored the impulse to scan visually for wreckage and instead watched for smaller irregularities on his display, snapped branches, snow disturbed in patterns no wind alone would create, faint traces of leaked fuel, and weak intermittent radio bursts buried beneath the static. The battery drained faster than his calculations predicted because of the extreme cold, and Lena's voice crackled over his radio urging him to bring the unit back before it lost power entirely. But, at that exact moment, Owen spotted a thin streak of reflected light along a distant slope that did not belong to any natural surface. Rook 7 pushed closer toward the reflection, only for a violent crosswind to slam it against an outcropping of rock, damaging one of its secondary rotors and forcing Owen to abort the flight and guide it back on reduced power. The data it managed to collect fell short of confirming the helicopter's exact position, but it proved something significant, that a large object had crossed through that section of the valley shortly before losing altitude, a detail no other search asset had managed to establish. While Owen worked to repair the damaged rotor by lantern light, a threatening message appeared on his phone, warning him to stop using any data connected to Blackthorn systems, and he understood immediately that whoever had sabotaged the boardroom demonstration was now watching his movements in real time. High on the mountain, the temperature inside the wrecked cabin continued to fall, and Dean suggested they abandon the aircraft entirely, since the ledge beneath them showed troubling signs of instability. But Camille's injured leg made any extended movement through deep snow nearly impossible. Vivian faced an impossible choice between staying inside a shelter that might collapse under shifting snow or leading her injured companions out into a storm with no certainty anyone was even looking for them in the right place. And for the first time in her career, she had no report, no board, and no strategy to fall back on. In that silence, carried faintly through the howling wind, they heard a distant mechanical hum that sounded almost like rotor blades. And then, just as quickly, it vanished into the storm again, leaving all three of them wondering whether they had imagined it out of desperation. Owen replaced the broken rotor. warmed the drone's battery pack near a portable heater, and prepared for a second flight, this time using a rescue truck near the tree line as a makeshift mobile control station with Lena's approval. Rook 7 returned to the same slope and dropped 2 additional signal relay nodes, and the small network of temporary repeaters allowed Owen to finally catch an extremely faint pulse transmitting at irregular intervals, unmistakably the emergency beacon from the downed helicopter, though its voltage had degraded so severely that it could barely reach beyond a few hundred yards. The command tent fell silent as the thermal feed loaded on the main screen, every technician and volunteer leaning forward at once, and Owen felt his own pulse hammering in his ears as the crumpled shape of the fuselage finally resolved out of the gray static. He guided the drone closer to the wreckage and streamed thermal imagery back to the command post, revealing an empty cabin but 3 faint footprint trails leading away toward a narrow rock crevice nearby, proof that whoever had survived the crash had deliberately moved to safer ground. Lena immediately began calculating a ground route toward the crevice, tracing possible approaches on a topographic map while calling in updated coordinates to both remaining rescue teams, her voice steady but noticeably faster than it had been all night. Owen kept Rook 7 circling the area at a careful distance, unwilling to risk another collision now that the drone represented the only working eyes anyone had on the survivors, and he watched the footprint trail carefully for any sign it had doubled back or gone still along the way. The trail held steady and unbroken all the way to the crevice entrance, and for the first time since the helicopter had vanished from the tracking display, something in the command tent that had felt impossibly heavy began, just slightly, to lift. The drone scanned the serial number stamped on the ruined beacon unit, and Owen felt a cold recognition settle over him because it matched the exact batch of regulated power cells his own diagnostic software had flagged as non-compliant months earlier, the same finding buried during the board's rushed cancellation of his project. Owen pulled up the maintenance logs he still had saved locally from his final weeks at the company, cross-referencing purchase orders against the batch numbers stamped into the failed beacon casing, and the pattern that emerged left no room for innocent explanation. Every unit from that particular shipment had been approved through an expedited process that bypassed the usual independent testing lab, a shortcut authorized under a signature that traced directly back to Wexler's division, saving the company a considerable sum while quietly putting hundreds of emergency devices into service without proper certification. Wexler demanded that Lena cut the live video feed immediately, insisting the technical schematics were proprietary company information, but the speed and intensity of his reaction only deepened her suspicion that something beyond simple corporate caution was driving his behavior. Owen finally understood the full shape of the sabotage, realizing that if Rook 7's diagnostic system had ever gone into full production, it would have exposed hundreds of defective emergency devices already installed across the company's fleet. Up on the mountain, Vivian and the others sheltered beneath a narrow rock overhang while Dean attempted to fire off an emergency flare, but the driving wind and heavy snowfall swallowed any trace of the light within seconds of its launch. Rook 7 detected a cluster of heat signatures gathered inside the crevice, and Owen carefully lowered a small radio unit along with an emergency thermal blanket down through the narrow gap in the rocks toward them. A weak, static-filled voice rose from the radio moments later, unmistakably Vivian's, asking whether this was the same drone she had once dismissed as worthless in front of her entire board. Owen answered simply that it was, and that it had just found her. Locating the survivors did not mean bringing them safely off the mountain, since a deep ravine separated their position from the nearest viable extraction route, a gap far too wide and unstable for anyone to cross on foot in the current conditions. Rescue helicopters remained grounded by the storm, and the ground teams needed at least 6 hours to circle the ridge on foot, time they did not have before a second, colder front arrived well before sunrise. Owen instructed Vivienne over the radio to check Dean's shoulder and Camille's leg, urging all three to stay close together for warmth, ration what remained of their radio battery, and avoid returning to the wrecked cabin, since sensor readings showed the snowpack directly above the ledge beginning to shift. At the command post, Wexler tried to seize Owen's laptop outright, accusing him of illegally accessing company networks and claiming his unauthorized involvement could compromise the official rescue effort entirely. Lena demanded Wexler produce the full certification records for the emergency beacon units, and when he refused, citing corporate confidentiality, her patience for his objections finally ran out completely. Owen pulled up the data recovered from the strange module found after the failed demonstration, and its encrypted signature traced directly to an administrative account under Wexler's own division, a connection too specific to dismiss as coincidence. No formal charge had been filed yet, but Lena stripped Wexler of any further authority over rescue operations on the spot, instructing local security personnel to escort him out of the command area immediately. Before he left, Wexler quietly triggered a remote deletion command targeting Rook 7's cloud storage, and Owen barely managed to sever the network cable in time, though the drone still lost a portion of the terrain data it had just gathered. High above, a sharp cracking sound echoed across the slope directly over Vivienne's group, and loose snow began sliding down the mountainside toward the crevice where they had taken shelter. Owen ordered them to move deeper into the rock formation immediately, and Rook 7 circled overhead, using its onboard alert tone to guide them through the blinding whiteout conditions surrounding them. All three survivors scrambled clear of the slide just moments before a wave of snow buried the wrecked helicopter completely, erasing the last physical evidence of where they had crashed. With the only visible shelter gone, the sole remaining path down the mountain now ran directly through a ravine. None of them carried the equipment to cross. Vivienne asked whether Rook 7 could somehow pull each of them across the ravine one at a time, and Owen told her plainly that the drone had never been built to lift a human being, that its strength lay elsewhere entirely. The blunt answer forced her to remember exactly why she had mocked the design in the first place, because in that boardroom she had only cared whether the machine could deliver a dramatic, camera-ready rescue rather than perform the quieter, more essential work it was actually engineered for. Owen explained its real function clearly, that it only needed to carry a thin, high-strength guideline across the gap, allowing the rescue team on the far side to use that line to haul across a much heavier climbing rope capable of bearing real weight. The obstacle was distance, since Vivienne's position sat well beyond the range of stable communication, forcing Owen to relocate his entire control setup to an old fire lookout tower nearly 1,000 meters higher on the ridge. Lena wanted to send someone else up in his place, but only Owen understood how to manually recalibrate the drone's signal by hand, and he began the climb alongside two members of her team through driving wind and thickening ice. The trail up to the lookout tower had not been maintained in years, and in places the old wooden steps had rotted through completely, forcing Owen and the two rescue technicians to test each foothold before committing their weight to it. His hands had gone numb inside his gloves within the first 20 minutes, and more than once the wind gusted hard enough to flatten him against the rock face, forcing him to wait, breathless, until it passed before continuing upward. He thought about turning back exactly once, when a technician beside him slipped and nearly went over the edge of a narrow switchback, but the memory of Vivienne's static-filled voice on the radio kept him moving forward, one careful step after another. Partway up the trail, Tessa called after seeing her father's name mentioned in a news broadcast, and Owen made her no promises about his own safety, telling her only that he was doing exactly what he had always taught her, refusing to abandon someone simply because they had once wronged him. Down in the crevice, Vivian's voice came through the radio one last time before Owen began the climb, offering an apology that carried none of the polish she used in boardrooms. Owen did not brush the apology aside, nor did he dwell on it, telling her only that they would speak properly once she was safely off the mountain and warm again. When he finally reached the lookout tower, he found its old antenna mast thick with ice, forcing him to bypass the drone's usual wireless link and wire the controller directly into the tower's aging analog line. Rook 7 lifted off carrying a spooled guideline, immediately fighting a crosswind strong enough to push it well off its intended path, and its battery held only enough charge for a single uninterrupted attempt at the crossing. Owen watched the signal strength drop steadily on his display, calculating wind resistance against dwindling power with numbers that offered him almost no margin for error. Somewhere over the ravine, the drone's tracking icon flickered once on the screen and disappeared entirely, vanishing less than 30 meters from the far edge of the gap. With visual tracking gone under the heavy snow cover, Owen switched entirely to inertial data and faint acoustic feedback, estimating the drone's heading from subtle changes in rotor pitch and vibration rather than any camera feed. Lena urged him to release the line and consider the flight lost, but Owen noticed the wind pattern rising sharply out of the ravine itself, and instead of fighting it, tilted the drone's frame to ride the very updraft threatening to push it off course. Rook 7 cleared the gap successfully, but its guideline snagged tightly on a low branch just short of the far bank, and its battery indicator dropped below 10% almost immediately after. Vivian stepped out from their shelter exactly as Owen instructed, using a long branch to work the tangled line free, while Dean held her steady from behind against the force of the wind. The drone finally released the line and dropped safely into the snow on the opposite bank, its essential task complete even though it no longer carried enough power to make the return flight home. Rescue crews used that thin guideline to haul a far heavier climbing rope across the ravine, then anchored it securely and rigged a working system for crossing the gap one person at a time. Camille went first, followed shortly by Dean, while Vivian insisted on crossing last despite Lena's strong preference to send her earlier given how much her core temperature had already dropped. Camille had noticed it building for hours already, the way Vivian kept handing off the thermal blanket to whoever seemed colder. The way she insisted Dean drink the last of the water despite her own hands shaking uncontrollably, small choices that bore little resemblance to the calculating executive Camille had worked alongside for years. It was not a transformation exactly, more a stripping away of everything that boardrooms and quarterly earnings calls had layered over her, revealing something that had perhaps always been there underneath. Just as Vivian began her crossing, the anchor point on her side started working loose from the surrounding ice, a shift Owen detected through the tension sensor, still linked to Rook 7's abandoned guideline. For a long, breathless moment nobody moved, the only sound the low groan of shifting ice beneath the anchor and the wind tearing across the ravine, and Owen felt the same cold focus settle over him that he remembered from years spent keeping helicopters airborne through weather no sane pilot wanted to fly in. He called an immediate halt, adjusted the angle of the pull, and directed the team to set a second anchor point before allowing her to continue, aware that even a few more seconds of delay could have let the rope slip entirely off the icy ledge. Vivian made it across safely, only moments before the weakened section of ice gave way completely into the ravine below. For the first time in many long hours, every member of the rescue operation could finally reach every person who had gone missing that day, and the command post erupted in the kind of exhausted relief that only comes after a night spent fearing the worst. Vivian, Dean and Camille were carried down to a field medical station set up near the base camp, none of them suffering life-threatening injuries, though all three showed clear signs of exhaustion and mild hypothermia after their hours exposed to the storm. Vivian asked almost immediately about the drone, and Owen told her honestly that it remained somewhere on the far side of the ravine, likely buried beneath a fresh layer of snow by now. The following morning brought calmer weather, and a recovery team located Rook 7 with its outer shell badly dented and two of its rotors snapped clean off, though its internal memory had somehow survived completely intact. The recovered data told the entire story in sequence: the defective locator component, its exact serial number, the sabotage command issued during the boardroom demonstration, and the attempted deletion carried out in the middle of an active rescue operation. Blackthorn's board launched an independent investigation almost immediately, and the surviving records showed that Gideon Wexler had knowingly concealed a batch of substandard components in exchange for financial benefits from an outside supplier. Investigators combing through years of procurement records found the pattern extended further back than anyone initially suspected, with Wexler quietly steering contracts toward the same supplier on multiple occasions, always careful to keep each individual decision small enough to avoid drawing attention from the board. Employees who had once found him charming and persuasive now described a man who had built his entire career on the appearance of competence rather than the substance of it, a distinction that had cost real people real safety while he collected commissions behind closed doors. The company terminated him immediately and cooperated fully with the federal review that followed, and though the legal proceedings would stretch on for many months, the immediate danger posed by the defective equipment already in service was addressed within weeks through an emergency recall across the entire fleet. He had not caused the storm or forced the helicopter down himself, but concealing the defective equipment had cost the search teams precious hours in locating the survivors, and the full file was eventually handed over to federal investigators for further review. Vivienne called a public press conference days later, and rather than presenting herself as a hero who had simply survived a terrible ordeal, she openly admitted that she had once canceled a genuinely useful piece of rescue technology only because it failed to match the polished image she expected from her own company. In front of a room full of cameras, she placed the battered, dented Rook 7 on the table before her, setting it in almost the exact spot where it had once been mocked and dismissed. Reporters pressed her with questions about the acquisition deal that had nearly cost her life, about Wexler's dismissal, about whether Blackthorn intended to rebuild its safety protocols from scratch, and she answered each one directly, instead of deferring to the prepared statements her communications team had drafted the night before. When someone finally asked whether she regretted the words she had used to dismiss Owen's invention in that boardroom, Vivian paused for a long moment before admitting that she had judged the machine the same way she had once judged people, by its surface rather than its substance, and that the mistake had very nearly gotten her killed. She credited Owen by name, refusing to let the moment become a story about her own survival alone, and insisted that any coverage of the rescue include the fact that a fired engineer and a machine the company had thrown away were the reasons she was standing there at all. Vivian offered Owen his position back, this time as director of an entirely new rescue technology division, with a substantial salary and full authority to develop Rook 7 into a genuine commercial product. Owen did not accept immediately, and instead laid out 3 conditions he considered non-negotiable before he would return. First, every emergency system across the company's entire fleet needed to be independently reviewed by outside inspectors with no connection to Blackthorn itself. Second, Rook 7 had to be tested continuously alongside real working rescue teams in the field. not merely demonstrated inside laboratories or staged for promotional events. Third, rescue organizations serving smaller and lower-income communities needed guaranteed access to the technology at a genuinely affordable cost, rather than being priced out entirely by a corporation chasing maximum profit. Owen also insisted that any future safety concern raised by an engineer, regardless of their position within the company, be reviewed by an independent panel rather than filtered through a single executive with the power to bury it, a direct response to the months he had spent watching legitimate warnings disappear into Wexler's office without a trace. He wanted a system built so that no single person could ever again quietly decide which safety findings the board was allowed to see, and Vivian, chastened by everything the storm had taken from her, agreed that such a structure was long overdue. Vivian agreed to all three conditions without hesitation, not out of any lingering debt she felt toward Owen personally, but because she finally understood that an apology only carries real weight when it is followed by meaningful action. Several months later, an upgraded version of Rook 7 completed a full field trial alongside Lena Hartwell's rescue unit, performing exactly as intended across a series of demanding mountain conditions. Lena, who had once granted Owen only 10 grudging minutes outside a restricted zone, now stood beside him at the edge of the airfield reviewing flight logs with the easy familiarity of two people who trusted each other's judgment completely. She told him the new relay nodes had already helped her team locate 2 backcountry skiers stranded overnight the previous month, a rescue that would have taken considerably longer under the old methods, and Owen felt something settle in his chest that no boardroom approval had ever managed to give him. It was not vindication exactly, though there was some of that too, but something closer to relief. The quiet satisfaction of watching a tool finally do the work it had always been meant to do. Company designers proposed replacing the drone's worn, battered shell with something sleeker and more presentable for marketing purposes, but Owen insisted on keeping one small section of the original scarred casing intact, a physical reminder of exactly where the machine had been and what it had already survived. Tessa came to watch the trial, appearing only briefly near the story's end, and asked her father why he had not simply repaired every dent and scratch along the drone's frame. Owen told her that a rescue machine never needed to look flawless, that all it truly needed to do was come home carrying proof that someone else had made it home too. Tessa smiled at that, the same quiet, knowing smile her mother used to give him, and admitted that she finally understood why he had spent so many years bent over a workbench instead of chasing something easier or more profitable. She had grown up watching him lose contracts to flashier competitors, watching him rebuild the same prototype over and over after every setback, and only now, standing on a cold airfield watching rescue technicians run their final checks, did she see clearly what all of it had actually been for. Owen put an arm around her shoulder, and for a moment neither of them said anything else, content simply to watch the drone crew's work in the pale winter light, a small operation that had grown, slowly and deliberately, out of a machine nobody had believed in. Somewhere behind them, a technician called out a final systems check, her voice carrying easily across the quiet airfield, and Owen felt the old familiar readiness settle back into his hands, the same steadiness that had once carried a battered prototype through a storm. Nobody expected it to survive. In the final scene, an emergency beacon activated somewhere in a distant mountain range, and Rook 7 was lifted onto its launch platform once more, ready to answer the call. Vivian asked no questions this time about how the machine appeared or whether its design suited the company's image, choosing instead to step back and let Owen take full control of the operation without interference. The drone climbed steadily into the falling snow, disappearing into the storm exactly as it had done once before, carrying with it the quiet certainty that no rescue in these mountains would ever again be attempted without it.